For decades after it happened, Operation Mars would be taught in Soviet history books as a brilliant and effective diversion scheme that masterfully deceived the Germans. The official story claimed that Operation Uranus, the ambitious Soviet thrust to encircle Stalingrad, was the cornerstone of the Red Army's offensive, while Operation Mars was merely a secondary diversion assault, aimed at keeping the Germans near Rzhev from reinforcing the embattled city. But as Operation Uranus unfolded, the Soviets launched a second pincer maneuver on a salient located in the northern town of Rzhev. The tumultuous assault kept the German Ninth Army engaged, leading a desperate defensive effort and prohibiting the soldiers from reinforcing their comrades in Stalingrad as they were being besieged. Nevertheless, another version of the events would emerge 5 decades later, portraying Operation Mars not as a clever distraction that fooled the German armies, but as a massive botched assault aimed to be even more significant than Uranus. The operation was filled with reckless actions and appalling mistakes that would lead to one of the most ruinous Soviet defeats in the war, earning the name of the Rzhev meat grinder. Thorn in the side. In late September of 1942, after years of barely resisting the advancing Wehrmacht, members from the Soviet Armed Forces headquarters, Stavka, and other leaders began formulating a strategy to change the tide of the war against the Axis powers. These plans would reflect the bitter learned experiences of the prior year and a half and take advantage of the increasingly depleted German forces. One of the men who played a significant role in the Stavka planning sessions was the famed Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who earned Stalin's trust for his victorious fight against the Japanese in 1939. In his view, the Rzhev salient, which contained Army Group Center's powerful German Ninth Army and was only 125 miles from Moscow, posed the most severe threat to the Soviet war effort. As a result of Operation Barbarossa, the salient, located in the northern town of Rzhev, was formed alongside the front line in the direction of Moscow. Then, after the Soviets failed to take back the salient in the late summer of 1942, Zhukov was convinced to try again, but with the weather on his side. The general was confident that his forces, alongside the strategic reserves assembled by the Stavka, would be strong enough to allow the Red Army 2 large and mutually supporting strategic counteroffensives. Initially planned for late October, the twin operations were named Operation Mars and Operation Uranus, the Soviet attack on the Rzhev salient and the strategic counteroffensive near Stalingrad. By conducting Mars and Uranus, along with follow-up operations Jupiter and Saturn, the Soviet Stavka sought to regain the upper hand on the Eastern Front and finally set the Red Army on a direct path to victory. The focal point. Appropriately named after the Roman god of war, Operation Mars was the centerpiece of all Soviet strategic plans in the fall of 1942. It was a colossal assault on Germany's most fortified position that would push them away from Moscow and open a Soviet path to Berlin. The plan for Mars bore all the characteristics of a Zhukov-led offensive. In a strangling pincer maneuver, the Red Army forces would simultaneously attack all sectors to maximize all pressure on the Germans by launching the main attacks against the core of the Rzhev salient from the east and the west. General Zhukov aimed to envelop German forces in the area with frontal assaults. This way, the Russians would not have to conduct complex maneuvers with mobile forces across the arduous terrain and winter conditions. In order to achieve quick success, Zhukov told his front commanders to mass their troops and commit all of their armor in the beginning stages of the battle. By doing this, Zhukov hoped that Soviet armored spearheads would then sever vital German communications routes, key roads, and rail lines in the vicinity of the Rzhev salient. About 668,000 men and nearly 2,000 tanks were directly used for Operation Mars, while 700,000 men and 1,400 tanks were selected for Uranus. In addition to the immense scale of the forces heading towards the Rzhev salient, its proximity to the capital made it look as though Mars was more crucial than Operation Uranus. For all that, the Soviets were actually facing some of the most formidable defense tacticians the German army had to offer. Günther von Kluge was the commander of Army Group Center and a brilliant strategist highly valued by Hitler. Despite his open disagreements with Nazi ideology, the dictator tolerated his opposing views due to his superb performance in both offensive and defensive operations. Meanwhile, the German Ninth Army, the force currently holding Rzhev, was commanded by General Model, a strategist as bright as Zhukov, with special proficiency in defensive strategies. An innovative and resourceful man, Model constantly developed a new defensive strategy that allowed him to assemble tight German lines in short amounts of time. German bulwark. At the beginning of November, a double agent in Moscow informed the Germans of an incoming attack in Rzhev. This sudden information matched previous reports German intelligence had gathered. As such, they immediately began to prepare the defenses, and von Kluge summoned the support of the 12th Panzer Division from the south. The German informant disclosed the existence of several Soviet assaults that would occur during the following weeks, but he did not mention Operation Uranus. This would later support Zhukov's claims that Operation Mars was a deliberate diversion from the fundamental objective of the Red Army, the encirclement of Stalingrad. With the support of von Kluge, Model had enough time and resources to prepare a significant defensive operation. Using his knack for defensive innovation, the general created groups of highly mobile forward scouts who were directly connected to the German artillery battalions, thus allowing for instant defensive artillery barrages in the case of an attack. Additionally, the artillery pieces were reorganized to maximize their coverage, mobility, and synchronization, bestowing them with an increased agency so they could function independently from other army units. Against Hitler's orders, Model assembled complex defensive lines with a series of fallback defensive posts that allowed the Germans to make tactical retreats in considerable safety without losing their dominion over the territory. Under Model's continuous supervision, the Germans then built 559 earth and timber emplacements, as well as almost 5 miles of anti-tank ditches and vast minefields. Before the strike, Germany had managed to amass a force of over 350,000 men and almost 2,000 tanks for the defense of Rzhev. Every city and town in the region was heavily fortified, and German propaganda dubbed the Rzhev salient as the Führer's impregnable line, claiming that its loss would be equivalent to losing half of Berlin. Bloody Mars. Although slated to launch on October 28th, bad weather caused Operation Mars, also known as the Second Rzhev Offensive, to begin in the early hours of November 25, 1942. Zhukov relied on pressure across the entire front and believed his powerful mechanized and tank corps would be enough to achieve victory. Nevertheless, the joint operation between the Soviet Western Front and the Kalinin Front got off to a bad start, as snow and fog forced most air support to the ground. The weather also reduced the effect of the massive Soviet artillery barrages preceding the main attacks, as the forward artillery observers could not adjust fire and observe their results. While the two western thrusts penetrated deeply into their terrains, the northern and eastern flanks only moved slightly forward. Even so, the German defenders fought fiercely and clung to their strongpoints, often centered on many of the small villages in the Rzhev area. The tactical defense, made up of relatively small but determined combat groups, used man-made obstacles to maximize effect, and successfully bottled up many attacking Soviet mobile forces before reaching their key objectives in the German operational rear area. Despite repeated, persistent attacks from the Red Army, the German pre-planned artillery concentrations and small arms fire were able to cut down the incoming Soviets. Meanwhile, the Germans reacted to Operation Mars by shifting units within the salient against all Soviet advance points. Coupled with mounting Soviet losses and supply difficulties, the movements allowed the German troops to gain the upper hand and retake much of the lost ground. As such, the High Command slowly assembled the reserves necessary to counterattack and achieve victory. In the process, the Soviets suffered many casualties by separating the attacking infantry from their supporting mobile forces, and sometimes trapping them behind German lines. In only 25 days, the Red Army's Rzhev offensive ran out of steam, and the battle was over on December 20th, 1942. The defeat proved a humiliating debacle for the Red Army, costing the Soviets highly in manpower, tanks, and equipment, with little advance to show for it. Written by the victor. The Germans' proficient defense proved that the salient was unassailable, but their efforts would ultimately be futile. While Germany held Rzhev, Operation Uranus successfully encircled Stalingrad. This watershed event would unravel a chain of devastating losses for Germany, eventually leading to the annihilation of the Sixth Army and the incursion of the Red Army toward Berlin. In the face of such a critical strategic victory, the events of Operation Mars were spun with a very different perspective by Zhukov and the Soviet High Command. Eager to massage the figures and mask the devastating losses they had suffered at Rzhev, the Soviets spread a much more palatable narrative, where instead of a twin operation to Uranus, Mars had been planned as a minor operation aimed at fooling the Germans into staying north, while the Soviets enclosed the Sixth Army in the south. Although the conflicting accounts suggested that the events occurred as described by Zhukov, it would take the decades-long effort and untiring research of American military historian David M. Glantz to finally reveal the true nature of Operation Mars. In his 1999 book, Zhukov's Greatest Defeat, The Red Army's Epic Disaster in Operation Mars 1942, Glantz laid out the massive amounts of resources and planning that went into Operation Mars, and how the troops committed to the assault were even more significant than those deployed to Uranus. Glantz boldly stated that it was not Operation Uranus that was supposed to be the large-scale Soviet onslaught that would shift the balance of the war. Instead, Operation Mars would have cleared Moscow of immediate danger and opened a path directly into Berlin. Based on a vast exploration of the Soviet archives, the controversial book depicts a humiliating defeat for the Soviets, one so significant that if Operation Uranus had also failed, it could have changed the course of the war. Aftershock. Despite its thorough research, many historians still question Glantz's account and continue to toy with the idea of Mars being only a distraction. To this, Glantz responded, quote, "In the unlikely event that Zhukov was correct, and Mars was really a diversion, there has never been one so ambitious, so large, so clumsily executed, or so costly." According to Glantz, 100,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives, 235,000 were wounded, and over 1,500 tanks were destroyed or severely damaged. The Germans managed to inflict such catastrophic damage only at the cost of 40,000 casualties, making the battle a decisive German tactical victory. Nevertheless, if seen through the widest strategic lens, despite not achieving all its objectives, the Soviet assault weakened the German Ninth Army significantly and kept them occupied long enough for the fate of Stalingrad to be sealed. Under this assessment, Operation Mars was crucial to the Soviet resurgence and eventual victory in the West, with the so-called Rzhev meat grinder proving a necessary sacrifice to achieve a quicker victory over the Nazi regime. Thank you for watching our video. For more epic war stories forgotten by time, click on your screen and check out another of our Dark Documentaries channels, where we document the actions of the bravest men and the technology that changed the world's fate. Stay tuned.